Hey, welcome back, guys. If you remember from last lecture, we talked about glycolysis, which is the process that breaks glucose, which is a 6-carbon molecule. So here's glucose with its 6 carbons, into two 3-carbon pyruvic acid molecules. So here's one pyruvic acid, here's the second pyruvic acid. And each of those are 3 carbons. So essentially what we had here was the transfer of energy from ATP to ADP in order to initially break the molecule of glucose into 3-carbon molecules here, and then a few more chemical reactions including NAD plus and ADP to end up forming your pyruvic acid. And if you remember, there was only 2 ATP that were created that can be used as an energy source for after glycolysis, which really is not enough energy. So it needs to be a few more processes that go on in the mitochondria in order to take the glucose, which is now in pyruvic acid form, and to make it into something that can be used by the body as energy. So we need to create more ATP. So today we're going to talk about how we do that. And the first step in that cycle is called the Krebs cycle. And that is the second stage of cellular respiration. Now this stage is actually the first stage that actually happens in the mitochondria. So it actually occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. And what it does is it uses the pyruvic acid created during glycolysis. So here's your 3-carbon pyruvic acid. So here's a single pyruvic acid right now. So it takes that pyruvic acid and it basically converts that into molecules that can be sent to something called the electron transport chain, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Now, if you look, this resembles the Kelvin cycle that we talked about in photosynthesis. And it resembles that because if you notice, you have a lot of carbon molecules being recycled. All right, so you've got a 4-carbon compound that eventually will get recycled and be the beginning of the cycle again. So the only difference, or the major difference between the Krebs cycle and the Kelvin cycle, is that instead of using ATP like the Kelvin cycle, the Krebs cycle actually creates it. So the Krebs cycle is what we are looking at to create a few more ATP for the body. And what ends up happening is it creates another 2 ATP. So let's briefly talk about it. Again, this is a little bit more information you guys need to know, but it's interesting to take a look at. So what happens is your pyruvic acid comes in, and this is where your carbon dioxide is created during cellular respiration. So all this carbon dioxide that you breathe out on a daily basis, it comes from the Krebs cycle. And so as you lose a carbon molecule from carbon dioxide, your pyruvic acid gets converted into something called acetyl-CoA, which then enters your Krebs cycle, and which is also known as a citric acid cycle, and essentially gets created into citric acid, which then the citric acid loses a CO2. So here's another carbon dioxide that is created. And throughout this process, you have NAD being produced into NADH. And as that continues to work, you have more carbon leave. And essentially what happens is you regain this 4-carbon compound, which will then again, later on down the line, form with another acetyl-CoA to create your citric acid. However, the important thing that you really should note here is not only the production of 3 carbon dioxide molecules, so you have 3 CO2 per pyruvic acid, but what is important to note is that you have 1, 2, 3, 4 NADHs created. You have 1 ATP created, and you have 1 FADH2 created. This is a new molecule, but it acts very much like NADH. So let's take a look at what we used. So in this, we used pyruvic acid. Okay, and the pyruvic acid essentially helped us create carbon dioxide because pyruvic acid is a carbon compound. And the function of pyruvic acid is essentially to create NADH, ATP, and FADH2. And again, we have ADP being converted into ATP. Okay, so we've got two of those that will get created from one glucose. We get 6 carbon dioxide because if one pyruvic acid creates 3 carbon dioxides, if you have the second pyruvic acid from glycolysis come in, you're going to create another 3, giving you a total of 6. And you'll get a total of 2 ATP from the Krebs cycle. And the function of that is to provide the body energy. And lastly, you have the NADH and FADH2, but we're going to most notably talk about NADH. Well, actually, the NAD plus is converted into NADH. And what that does is that is basically sent to the electron transport chain. So your NADH is sent to your electron transport chain. The ATP is used for energy in the body, and your CO2 is then released to the atmosphere as a result of exhaling through your lungs. So glycolysis makes things for the electron transport chain. The Krebs cycle makes things for the electron transport chain. And this is essentially a very similar process to the light reactions of photosynthesis. So if you look, the NADH2 that was created is going to be used during the beginning of the electron transport chain. And what happens is your NADH reacts with this enzyme here. This is an enzyme. And by doing so, NADH gets split into NAD plus, and you have your H plus ions. Okay? And those H plus ions are then going to get pumped up through these enzymes as well, through the membrane, to create a membrane a gradient. And then what ends up happening is the electron from the NADH here is going to start your electron transport chain, which ends up going down here, combining with oxygen and hydrogen to form your water. So this is where your water comes from in the products of your cellular respiration formula. So water comes from the electron transport chain. Just like in photosynthesis, water was split at the beginning of the electron transport chain. In cellular respiration, water is formed during the end of the electron transport chain. Another high-energy electron source is FADH2, and the FADH2 releases its hydrogens and provides energy for the electrons to flow down the electron transport chain. So these are essentially high-energy molecules that function in allowing your electrons to transport down the ETC. And they also provide energy to form your hydrogen gradient here, which, if you guys recognize, will then be able to transport itself down the ATP synthase in order to create ATP from your adenosine diphosphate. So again, if we look at what's used, you have NADH, creates NAD plus, and the function of that is to provide electrons for the electron transport chain. Okay, you have your FADH2 to FAD, and what that does again is it provides energy for ETC. Then you have your oxygen. Your oxygen is used in addition to your H plus ions to create your H2O, which is then excreted by the body. And then lastly, you have your ADP getting converted into ATP, which is used for energy by the body. Sorry for my writing, it's a little bit messy. So it's used for energy by the body. All right, so that's your electron transport chain. Very similar to the light reactions. Except for the energy is provided by NADH and FADH2 instead of the sunlight. So let's take a look at what all this means. That's a lot of complicated stuff that you guys might not understand, which is fine. If you want to understand it, please let me know, but by no means you do have to memorize all of this stuff. Simply you need to know that oxygen creates water and ADP is created or creates ATP. But what you should really know is that during your different cycles, okay, you create a bunch of NADH, okay, and FADH2. So during glycolysis, you create NADH, okay, and you create 2 of those, which when you create 2 NADH, it actually creates 4 ATP. All right, so you've got 2 ATP during the produced during glycolysis. You've got 4 that are produced as a result of the NADH during glycolysis. And then at the beginning of the Krebs cycle, you have 2 NADH created, which produces 6 ATP. And then 6 NADH creates 18 ATP. Your Krebs cycle creates 2 itself. And then your FADH2 is responsible for creating 4. So essentially what you have is you have the theoretical yield of approximately 36 ATP for 1 glucose molecule. So 1 glucose equals 36 ATP. And this is how you get a very slow breakdown of your glucose, okay? And by doing so, you produce a lot of this ATP that can be used. And this is happening every second of your of the day. So it's happening now in your body. It's happening when you sleep. It's happening when you eat. So this is a very important process that occurs in the mitochondria of your cells. Now, if you have any questions, please let me know. But tomorrow we'll talk about a quick summary of cellular respiration, and we'll do a little worksheet on this. So, have any questions, write them down or let me know, and I will talk to you tomorrow.